At 2 p.m. on the 14th of April 1935, a wall of black dust rose on the southern horizon of the Texas Panhandle. It stretched from the Caprock Escarpment in the west to the Oklahoma border in the east. The sky above the town of Amarillo had been clear that morning. The wind had been light. Farmers had gone about their work, checking fences, tending to livestock, and hoping for rain that never came. By noon, the temperature had dropped. The wind changed direction. Then the dust arrived. The day would become known as Black Sunday. It was not the first dust storm of the decade, nor the last, but it was the one that broke something in the American consciousness. When the sun disappeared at 2 in the afternoon, when the air turned to grit and the earth rose up into the sky, millions of people across the Great Plains saw something they did not have words for. The sky turned black, not gray, not brown, black. What happened? The storm system that produced Black Sunday had been building for days. A cold front moving south from Canada collided with warm air rising from the Gulf of Mexico. That combination usually produces thunderstorms. But there was no rain in the clouds that gathered over the plains that week. The clouds were made of soil, dry, pulverized topsoil that had been stripped from millions of acres of farmland. The wind lifted that soil into the air and carried it east. When the front accelerated, the dust became a moving mountain. The leading edge of the storm was estimated to be 500 miles wide. It moved at speeds approaching 60 miles per hour. In the town of Guymon, Oklahoma, residents later described the approaching storm as a rolling black cloud with a flat bottom. Some said it looked like a giant hand sweeping across the earth. Others said it looked like a waterfall of dirt falling upward. Children who saw it from schoolyard playgrounds ran inside. Teachers told them it was a storm, but the teachers did not believe their own words. They had never seen anything like it. The storm hit Guymon at 2:30 p.m. Within minutes, visibility dropped to zero. Streetlights came on. Cars pulled to the side of the road. People walking outside covered their faces with handkerchiefs and coats. Some did not make it home. They found shelter in barns, in stores, in the homes of strangers. Families who had closed their windows and doors found a fine layer of dust settling on every surface inside. It came through the cracks around doors. It came through the threads of window screens. It came through walls. Mothers put wet towels at the bottoms of doors. It did not matter. The dust came anyway. How could this have happened? The question has been asked for nearly a century. The answer is not a simple one. It begins with geography. The Great Plains are a semi-arid region. Rainfall is unpredictable. Drought is a natural part of the climate cycle. Before European settlement, the land was covered in deep-rooted grasses that held the soil in place even during dry periods. The grasses evolved over thousands of years to survive both drought and flood. Their root systems formed a dense mat beneath the surface. When drought came, the roots held the earth. When rain returned, the grasses grew back. That system collapsed in the span of a few decades. The first change was the plow. Homesteaders and settlers broke the sod in the late 1800s. They planted wheat. Wheat was a cash crop. It paid for seed, equipment, and land. It fed a growing nation. During World War I, wheat prices soared. The United States government encouraged farmers to expand production to support the war effort. Plows tore into land that had never been farmed. The plow was called the sod buster. It was a steel blade that cut through the tough root system of the prairie grasses. When the grasses were cut, the soil was exposed. In the 1800s, mechanized farming took over. Tractors replaced horses. Combines replaced hand harvesting. A farmer could plant and harvest thousands of acres with a fraction of the labor required a generation earlier. But the same machines that made farming efficient also made it destructive. The tractor could pull deeper plows. It could turn over more soil. It could strip the land faster than any team of horses. By 1930, an estimated 100 million acres of prairie had been plowed under. The soil that remained was loose, dry, and vulnerable. It was not soil in the way that farmers understood soil. It was powder. Decades of organic matter had been depleted by continuous wheat cropping. The land had been mined, not farmed. Then the rain stopped. The drought that gripped the plains in the 193's rows was not a short, dry spell. It lasted most of the decade. 1934 was the driest year in the history of the United States up to that point. 1936 was worse. The lack of rainfall meant that nothing could grow. Without crops, the exposed soil had no roots to hold it. Without rain, the soil dried out completely. The wind did the rest. The geography of the Dust Bowl is often described as the Southern Plains. It covers the panhandles of Texas and Oklahoma, western Kansas, eastern Colorado, and northeastern New Mexico. This region sits at the intersection of prevailing westerly winds and dry high-pressure systems that push down from Canada. The wind is constant. In the 193's rows, the wind had nothing to stop it. Dust storms had been recorded in the region before. The 1890's saw severe storms during a drought cycle, but nothing approached the scale and intensity of the 193's rows. The reason was the scale of the agricultural destruction. The land was not just dry, it was dead. The United States Soil Conservation Service estimated in the mid-193's rows that 300,000 square miles of land had been affected by wind erosion. That is an area larger than the state of Texas. Within that region, more than 100 million acres of topsoil had blown away. Not temporarily. It was gone. The nutrient-rich layer that had taken thousands of years to form was carried east in clouds so dense they blocked the sun. The human cost was measured in displacement, illness, and death. By 1940, approximately 2.5 million people had left the Plains states. The largest migration in American history was not the westward movement of the 19th century. It was the exodus of the Dust Bowl refugees. They went to California, Oregon, Washington, Arizona, and the cities of the Midwest. They went in cars loaded with mattresses and children. They went because staying meant watching their children breathe dust. The health effects were devastating. The microscopic particles of silica in the dust did not stay in the lungs. They entered the bloodstream. Doctors reported cases of dust pneumonia, a condition that had no established treatment. In 1935 alone, the Kansas State Board of Health estimated that dust-related illnesses caused the deaths of several hundred people. The exact number is unknown. Many deaths were attributed to other causes, but the families who buried their loved ones knew what killed them. The federal government responded with programs designed to address the crisis. The Soil Conservation Service was established in 1935 under the leadership of Hugh Hammond Bennett. Bennett had been warning about soil erosion for decades. He used Black Sunday as a turning point. When the storm reached Washington, D.C. 3 days later, Bennett used it to push the Soil Conservation Act through Congress. The logic was simple. If the dust could reach the Capitol, the country could no longer ignore the problem. Conservation programs were implemented across the plains. Farmers were paid to plant grass and trees. Contour plowing and terracing were introduced. Shelter belts, long rows of trees planted to break the wind, were established across a 100-mile-wide corridor from Canada to Texas. The Civilian Conservation Corps planted more than 200 million trees in the region during the 193's rows. Some of those trees are still standing, but conservation was not the same as recovery. For the people who lived through the Dust Bowl, recovery meant leaving. The land could not support them. The banks held the mortgages. Many farmers lost everything. The photographs taken by Farm Security Administration photographers like Dorothea Lange, Arthur Rothstein, and Walker Evans documented the exhaustion, the ruined homes, the skeletal livestock, and the faces of people who had been ground down by forces they could not control. Lange's photograph of Florence Owens Thompson, known as Migrant Mother, became the symbol of the Dust Bowl era. The image shows a woman in her early 30s who looks twice that age. Her children lean against her shoulders. Her face is lined with worry and strain. The photograph was taken in a pea pickers camp in California in 1936. Thompson and her family had left Oklahoma after the dust storms destroyed their farm. They had traveled west looking for work. They found a camp with no sanitation, no food, and no shelter. Lange took the photograph. It ran in newspapers across the country. It was one of thousands of images that told the story, but the images cannot capture the sound of the dust storms. Survivors describe the sound as a low roar, like a train coming through a tunnel, or a waterfall, or a wall of wind moving across open land. The sound preceded the darkness. When it arrived, the noise was everywhere. The wind carried dust that scoured paint from buildings and sand-blasted the bark off trees. It eroded fence posts to splinters. It buried machinery. It filled water wells with dirt. When the darkness came, people turned on lamps. They lit candles. They sat in their homes and listened to the wind and the rattle of dirt hitting the windows and the coughing of their own lungs. Some prayed. Some did not. Some had given up on prayer. The storm lasted for hours. When it passed, the sky cleared, but the land was changed. The dust had rearranged the geography of the plains. Dunes formed where fields had been. Drifts of dirt covered roads. The topsoil that remained was piled against buildings and fences. Some houses were buried up to the windowsills. The storm system that produced Black Sunday moved east. It dropped dust on Chicago, Cleveland, New York, and Washington, D.C. Ships 300 miles out in the Atlantic reported dust falling on their decks. The phenomenon was not a local event. It was a national catastrophe that reached across the continent. The response from the federal government was uneven. Some programs helped, others did not. The Agricultural Adjustment Act paid farmers to reduce production, but it also contributed to the consolidation of land ownership. Large farming operations received more resources than small family farms. The tension between conservation and commercial agriculture continued for decades. The deeper lesson of the Dust Bowl is about the relationship between human activity and ecological systems. The plains were not destroyed by drought. They were destroyed by farming practices that treated soil as an infinite resource. The drought was the trigger, the soil erosion was the result, and the storm that turned the sky black was the warning. After Black Sunday, the term Dust Bowl entered the American vocabulary. It was coined by reporter Robert Jiger, who used the phrase in a dispatch from the plains in April 1935. Jiger wrote 3 words that stuck: the Dust Bowl. It was a perfect description. The land had become a bowl, and the wind was scooping it out. The storms continued after 1935. They continued in 1936, 1937, and 1938. The worst years were 1934 through 1936. By 1939, rain returned to much of the region. But the soil did not return. It would take decades of careful conservation, reseeding of native grasses, and changes in farming techniques before the plains stabilized. Some land never fully recovered. In the decades that followed, the Dust Bowl became a cautionary tale. It was studied by soil scientists, historians, economists, and climatologists. It entered school textbooks as an example of what happens when humans push a system too far. But the lessons were not always applied. In the 1950s, another drought struck the plains. It was nearly as severe as the 1930s. The difference was that conservation practices had been put in place. The land held. Dust storms occurred, but they were smaller. They did not reach the Atlantic. The sky did not turn black, but the system that caused the Dust Bowl did not disappear. The pressures on the plains remain. Groundwater depletion, industrial farming, climate change, and economic consolidation all threaten the region. The triggers are different, but the underlying vulnerability is the same. The land is still being farmed. The soil is still being lost. The question of whether another Black Sunday could happen is not a historical question. It is a question about the present. What investigators found when they looked backward at the Dust Bowl was not a single failure. It was a cascade: the failure of rainfall, the failure of farming practices, the failure of government oversight, the failure of economic systems that rewarded short-term profit over long-term stewardship, and the failure of foresight. The people who lived through the Dust Bowl did not know they were living through history. They knew they were living through something terrible. They wrote letters. They took photographs. They kept diaries. They described the dust in their food, in their beds, in their clothing, and in their lungs. They described the darkness. They described the sound. They describe the feeling of standing in their own fields and not being able to see their own hands. The story of the Dust Bowl is not only about the land. It is about what people did when the land turned against them. Some stayed, some fought, some left, some died, and some survived long enough to tell the story. But the story itself is not finished. The land is still there, the wind is still blowing, and the sky could turn black again. The question is whether the warnings will be heard. At 12:15 p.m. on the 14th of April 1935, a farmer named John McCarty was working in his field near Guymon, Oklahoma. He had heard the weather reports that morning. They had promised a clear day. The sky was bright. The wind was calm. He kept his head down and his hands on the plow. He did not see the wall of dirt until it was less than a mile away. By then it was too late to run. He dropped the plow and ran toward his house. The dust caught him before he reached the door. He covered his face with his shirt. He stumbled into the house blind and coughing. His wife had already lit a lamp. The darkness was absolute. They sat together on the floor. They listened to the roar. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. What happened in that moment was not unique. Across the plains, tens of thousands of people experienced the same event at the same time. Some were in school, some were in church, some were driving, some were in the fields. The storm did not discriminate. It hit every town, every farm, every road, and every house along a path that stretched from Montana to Texas. The wind speeds exceeded 60 miles per hour. The dust was not ordinary dirt. It was powdered topsoil, ground fine as flour by decades of overplowing and drought. It entered the lungs and stayed there. It caused a condition known as dust pneumonia. Children and the elderly were the most vulnerable. Hundreds died from respiratory failure in the months after Black Sunday. The exact number was never recorded. No one was counting. The storm system that produced Black Sunday was not a single event. It was the culmination of years of ecological collapse. The land had been drying out since 1930. The rains that had supported the wheat boom of the 1910s had vanished. The native grasses that held the soil in place had been plowed under. The roots were gone. The soil was loose. The wind did the rest. By 1935, the region had already endured 4 years of drought. Farmers had watched their crops wither. They had watched their livestock starve. They had watched the banks take their land. The storms were the final blow. Black Sunday was the worst, but it was not the last. Another major storm hit on the 11th of May, 1935. Then again on the 19th of June. Then again in July, August, and September. The storms continued through the winter and into the spring of 1936. They did not stop until the rain returned in 1939. How could this have happened? The answer lies in the history of the plains. The region had been settled rapidly in the late 19th century. The Homestead Act of 1862 granted land to settlers who agreed to farm it. The promise was that the plains could be turned into a breadbasket. For a time, it worked. The rainfall was above average in the 1870s and 1880s. Farmers poured in. They built towns. They planted wheat. They made money. But the rainfall was not normal. It was a temporary anomaly. When the drought returned, the land could not sustain the intensive farming that had been imposed on it. The federal government had encouraged settlement. It had sold land cheap. It had subsidized railroads that brought settlers west. It had promoted the idea that the plains were a garden waiting to be cultivated. But no one had studied the region's climate. No one had understood that the plains were a semi-arid environment where drought was a recurring pattern. The land had been managed for centuries by Native American tribes who moved with the seasons and did not plow the soil. That system had been destroyed. The new system was built on extraction. The Dust Bowl was a man-made disaster. The drought was natural. The wind was natural. The dust was not. The dust was the result of decisions made by people who believed that the land was inexhaustible. That belief was wrong. In the aftermath of Black Sunday, the federal government moved quickly. The Soil Conservation Service was established on the 27th of April, 1935, less than 2 weeks after the storm. The agency was given the authority to work with farmers to implement conservation practices. The first director was Hugh Hammond Bennett, a soil scientist who had been warning about erosion since the early 1900s. Bennett had testified before Congress many times. He had been ignored. Now he had a mandate. Bennett's strategy was simple. He wanted to stop the soil from blowing. He promoted contour plowing, which involved plowing along the natural curves of the land rather than in straight lines. He promoted terracing, which slowed the flow of water and reduced runoff. He promoted the planting of cover crops during fallow seasons. He promoted the use of crop rotation to maintain soil health. And he promoted the planting of shelter belts, long rows of trees planted to break the wind. The Shelter Belt program was one of the largest reforestation projects in American history. The goal was to plant a corridor of trees from the Canadian border to the Texas Panhandle. The corridor would be 100 miles wide. The trees would act as windbreaks. They would reduce the speed of the wind and trap the soil. The Civilian Conservation Corps planted more than 200 million trees in the region between 1935 and 1940. The trees were mostly native species like cottonwood, cedar, and locust. Some of those trees are still standing today. They are a living monument to the response. But the response was not enough for everyone. The conservation programs helped reduce the severity of later storms, but they could not undo the damage that had already been done. The land had been stripped of its fertility. The topsoil that had taken thousands of years to form was gone. The farmers who remained had to contend with soil that was thin, dry, and depleted. Many could not afford the cost of conservation. The government paid farmers to adopt new practices, but the payments were often delayed and the paperwork was complicated. Some farmers gave up. They sold their land and moved west. The migration from the Dust Bowl was one of the largest internal population movements in American history. Between 1930 and 1940, an estimated 2.5 million people left the plains. They traveled to California, Oregon, Washington, and Arizona. They traveled in cars and trucks packed with everything they owned. They traveled along Route 66. They traveled because they had no choice. The land could not support them. The banks had taken their farms. The dust had taken the rest. The migrants were called Okies, regardless of whether they came from Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, or Arkansas. The term was used as an insult. It implied poverty, ignorance, and failure. The migrants were met with hostility in California. They were accused of stealing jobs. They were forced to live in camps. They were paid low wages for hard labor. They were denied access to health care and education. They were treated as outsiders. The story of the migration was documented by photographers like Dorothea Lange, Arthur Rothstein, and Walker Evans. They worked for the Farm Security Administration. They were sent to the plains and the migrant camps to record the conditions. Their photographs are now iconic. Lange's photograph of Florence Owens Thompson, taken in a pea pickers camp in Nipomo, California, in March 1936, became the most famous image of the era. Thompson was 32 years old. She had 7 children. She had left Oklahoma after the dust storms destroyed her family's farm. She had traveled west with her husband and children. They had found work picking peas. The crop failed. They had no money. They had no food. They were living in a tent. Lange took the photograph. It was published in newspapers across the country. It inspired public sympathy. It also inspired government aid. The camp received food and supplies shortly after the photograph appeared, but the photograph did not change the underlying conditions. The migrants continued to struggle. The literary account of the migration came from John Steinbeck. His novel The Grapes of Wrath was published in 1939. It told the story of the Joad family, who left Oklahoma for California during the Dust Bowl. The novel was written in a style that blended journalism, fiction, and social commentary. It was based on Steinbeck's own observations of the migrant camps. He had spent time with the families. He had listened to their stories. He had seen the conditions. The Grapes of Wrath was a bestseller. It was also controversial. It was banned in some communities for its portrayal of farmers and landowners. It was criticized for being too sympathetic to the migrants, but it was also praised for giving a voice to people who had been invisible. The novel won the Pulitzer Prize in 1940. It was adapted into a film the same year. The film was directed by John Ford and starred Henry Fonda. It brought the story to a national audience. The migrants themselves did not often see their lives reflected in the photographs and the novels. They were too busy surviving. They worked in the fields, they built new homes, they sent their children to school, they formed communities, they adapted. Over time, many of them succeeded. They bought land, they started businesses, they became part of California's economy and culture. But the pain of the migration never fully left them. It was passed down to their children and their grandchildren. It became part of the family story. What investigators found when they looked backward at the Dust Bowl was not just a story of environmental collapse. It was a story of systemic failure. The failure began with the assumption that the plains could be farmed like the Midwest. It continued with the lack of regulation on land use. It was compounded by the economic pressures that forced farmers to produce as much as possible, as cheaply as possible. And it was deepened by a drought that was beyond anyone's control. The human cost was staggering. In addition to those who died from dust pneumonia, there were those who died from starvation, exposure, and disease. There were those who died from despair. There were suicides. There were families who simply disappeared into the landscape, their names never recorded. The mental health toll was enormous. People who lived through the Dust Bowl reported nightmares, anxiety, and depression for years afterward. The constant darkness, the constant fear, the constant sound of the wind. And yet the people who stayed did not give up. They found ways to cope. They shared food. They shared shelter. They shared work. They formed cooperatives to buy seed and equipment. They supported each other when the government failed to act. They built schools and churches out of the ruins. They taught their children to read and write. They maintained their dignity in the face of overwhelming loss. The role of the federal government in the recovery was mixed. Some programs helped. The Soil Conservation Service was one of them. The Farm Security Administration provided loans to farmers to buy land and equipment. The Resettlement Administration moved families off marginal land and onto better farms. The Works Progress Administration provided jobs building roads, schools, and parks. The Civilian Conservation Corps employed young men. These programs put money into the economy and gave people a sense of purpose, but other programs hurt. The Agricultural Adjustment Act paid farmers to reduce production, but the payments went to landowners, not to sharecroppers and tenant farmers. The sharecroppers were often evicted as a result. The banks continued to foreclose on farms. The government did not stop them. The economic system favored large-scale agriculture over small family farms. That trend continued after the Dust Bowl ended. By 1939, the rains returned. The drought was over. The storms stopped. The land began to heal. Grasses grew back. The dust settled. The shelter belts held. The soil started to rebuild, but the scars remained. The landscape had been reshaped. Some areas were permanently altered. The Ogallala Aquifer, which lies beneath the plains, had been tapped for irrigation during the drought. The water was being used faster than it could be replaced. That problem would only grow worse in the decades to come. The Dust Bowl ended, but the lessons did not. In the 1950s, another drought struck the plains. It was nearly as severe as the 1930s, but this time the conservation practices were in place. The soil held. The dust storms were smaller. The skies did not turn black. The difference was the presence of shelter belts, contour plowing, and crop rotation. The lessons of the Dust Bowl had been applied, but the lessons were not applied everywhere. In the 1970s, a new wave of plowing began on the plains. The demand for wheat and corn increased. Farmers stopped rotating crops. They planted the same fields year after year. They used chemical fertilizers to compensate for the loss of soil fertility. They irrigated from the Ogallala Aquifer. The water table began to drop. The soil began to erode again. Dust storms returned, though on a smaller scale. In the 1980s, another drought led to another spike in dust storms. The term Dust Bowl was used again. Some farmers remembered the 1930s, most did not. The cycle repeated itself. The land was pushed too hard, the rain stopped, the wind blew, the soil moved. The question of whether another Black Sunday could happen is not a historical question. It is a question about the present. The plains are still farmed. The soil is still being lost. The water is still being depleted. Climate is changing. The droughts are expected to become more frequent and more severe. The conservation practices that protected the land in the 1950s are not always followed. The pressure to produce cheap food is enormous. The system that caused the Dust Bowl has not been dismantled. It has been modified, but the underlying vulnerabilities remain. The story of the Dust Bowl is also a story about human resilience. It is about people who refused to be broken by the land they had broken. It is about the photographs and the novels and the reports that forced the nation to look at what it had done. It is about the wind and the dust and the darkness that became a symbol of what happens when we ignore the limits of the natural world. The survivors of the Dust Bowl carried the memory with them for the rest of their lives. They told their children. They told their grandchildren. The stories were passed down, often with the same details. The day the sky turned black. The day the world disappeared. The day they thought the end had come. In the town of Boise City, Oklahoma, the courthouse square still stands. It is the same square that was buried under drifts of dust in 1935. The town held a reunion in 1995, 60 years after Black Sunday. Some of the survivors came. They were old. They had wrinkled faces and thin hair. They remembered the storm. They remembered the fear. They remembered the sound. They stood in the square and looked at the sky. It was blue. The wind was calm. The dust was gone. One of them spoke. She said she still could not sleep when the wind blew. She said she still covered her face when she went outside on a dusty day. She said the dust was inside her. She said it never left. The memory of the Dust Bowl is not a relic of the past. It is a warning for the future. The land remembers. The wind remembers. The soil remembers. The question is whether we remember too. The question is whether we remember too. On the morning of April 14, 1935, the sky over the Great Plains was clear. The sun was bright. The wind was calm. Farmers in Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico went about their work. They had no reason to expect anything unusual. The drought had been going on for 4 years. The soil was dry. The fields were bare. But the day itself seemed ordinary. Then, just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the wind shifted. At 1:15 p.m., a wall of dust appeared on the northern horizon. It was not a cloud. It was a solid mass of brown and black, rising thousands of feet into the air. The leading edge was ragged and sharp, like a cliff of dirt moving across the land. People who saw it described it as a moving mountain. The wind behind it was measured at 60 miles per hour. The dust was not fine and powdery. It was thick. It carried rocks, sand, and debris. By 1:30 p.m., the storm had reached the town of Boise City, Oklahoma. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in minutes. The sky turned black. Visibility dropped to 0. People who were outside ran for shelter. They could not see their hands in front of their faces. They covered their mouths with cloths. They breathed through wet rags. The dust seeped through cracks in doors and windows. It filled houses. It coated furniture. It covered food. It got into lungs. At 2 p.m., the storm reached Amarillo, Texas. The city went dark. Streetlights came on. Car headlights were useless. The dust was so thick that people could not see the hood of their own car. Some drivers pulled over and waited. Others drove off the road. There were accidents. There were injuries. The dust piled up against buildings. It drifted like snow. Some drifts were 10 feet high. By 3 p.m., the storm had moved into Kansas. The same scene repeated. Towns disappeared. Schools dismissed students early. Teachers lit lanterns in classrooms. Children were told to sit under their desks. They covered their faces with their hands. The dust came in through the windows. It coated their clothes and their hair. Some children later reported that they thought the world had ended. At 4 p.m., the storm reached Colorado. Farmers who had been working in the fields became lost. They wandered in the dark. Some found their way home. Others did not. The storm continued south and east. It reached the Gulf of Mexico by the next day. It had traveled over 1,000 miles. It carried an estimated 300 million tons of topsoil. Much of that soil ended up in the Atlantic Ocean. The storm lasted from 1:30 p.m. until well after dark. When it finally passed, the sky cleared. The moon rose, the stars appeared, but the landscape was transformed. Fields were stripped of their remaining soil. Fences were buried, cars were buried, houses were buried. Livestock was found dead, suffocated by dust. The bodies of animals were scattered across the plains. What happened in the days that followed was a mix of shock and response. The storm had been the worst in the history of the region. It was the third major dust storm of the spring. But this one was different. It had been seen. It had been felt. It had made national news. The Associated Press reporter Robert Jiger was in the region. He traveled through the affected areas. He wrote a story that was published on April 15th. In that story, he used the phrase Dust Bowl for the first time. The name stuck. The immediate response was chaotic. Local governments did not have the resources to handle the crisis. The Red Cross distributed food and water. The Works Progress Administration provided emergency jobs, but the damage was already done. Thousands of people had been sickened. Hundreds had died. The exact number of deaths from dust pneumonia is not known. Estimates range from several thousand to over 7,000. The official count was never completed. The cause of death was often recorded as pneumonia. The link to dust was not always documented. How could this have happened? The question was asked in newspapers, in government offices, and in homes across the country. The answer was not simple. The Dust Bowl was not a single event. It was the result of a series of decisions, policies, and natural conditions that converged over decades. The most immediate cause was the drought, but the drought alone did not cause the dust storms. The soil had to be loose. The soil was loose because the native grass had been plowed up. The grass had been plowed up because farmers wanted to grow wheat. The wheat had been planted because the price of wheat was high. The price of wheat was high because of World War I and the demand for grain. The demand for grain had encouraged overproduction. The overproduction had led to soil exhaustion. The soil exhaustion had made the land vulnerable. The drought had finished the job. The federal government had been slow to act. In 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt created the Soil Erosion Service, later renamed the Soil Conservation Service. But the agency was small. Its recommendations were not mandatory. Farmers were not required to change their practices. The government also created the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which paid farmers to reduce production. But the payments went to landowners. The tenants and sharecroppers who actually worked the land were often evicted. The land was left fallow. The soil was exposed. In 1934, the government launched the Prairie States Forestry Project. The goal was to plant shelter belts across the plains. The shelter belts were strips of trees that would block the wind. The project planted over 200 million trees, but the trees took years to grow. The dust storms continued. The project was not enough to stop the crisis. By 1935, the government had realized that more drastic action was needed. The Resettlement Administration was created. It moved families off farms that could not support them. The families were given loans to buy better land. Some were relocated to communities in other states. The program was controversial. Many farmers did not want to leave. They had been on the land for generations. They did not trust the government. They stayed. The Farm Security Administration was also created. It provided loans and technical assistance to farmers. It also hired photographers to document the conditions. The photographs became famous. They showed the faces of the people who were suffering. They showed the empty fields. They showed the dust-covered houses. The photographs were published in magazines and newspapers. They were shown in government reports. They helped to create public support for the relief programs. But the relief programs were not enough to stop the dust storms. The storms continued through 1936 and 1937. In 1936, there were over 200 dust storms in the region. Some were as bad as Black Sunday. The wind carried dust all the way to the East Coast. It fell on Washington, D.C. It fell on New York. It fell on ships in the Atlantic. The dust was a reminder that the problem was not local. It was national. In 1937, the government passed the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act. The act provided payments to farmers who adopted conservation practices. The payments were voluntary, but they were enough to encourage many farmers to change. They began to rotate crops, they planted cover crops, they built terraces, they contoured their fields. The number of dust storms began to decline, but the decline was also due to the return of rain. In 1939, the drought ended. The rains came. The grasses grew back. The soil held. The shelter belts had begun to take effect. The land started to heal. The Dust Bowl was over. What investigators found when they looked backward at the Dust Bowl was not just a story of environmental collapse. It was a story of human systems that failed. The failure was not only in the soil, it was in the economy, it was in the government, it was in the culture. The economy of the plains had been built on the assumption that the land was infinite. Farmers believed that they could plow up the grass and plant wheat forever. The banks believed that they could lend money based on the value of the land. The railroads believed that they could ship grain to the east. All of these assumptions were wrong. The land was finite. The soil was not renewable on a human timescale. The system was unsustainable. The government had encouraged the expansion of agriculture. The Homestead Act of 1862 had given land to settlers. The railroads had been given land grants. The federal government had promoted the idea that the plains were a vast garden waiting to be tamed. The reality was different. The plains were a semi-arid region that required careful management. The government did not provide the education or the resources for that management. The culture of the plains also played a role. The farmers were independent. They did not like government interference. They believed that they knew their land better than any bureaucrat in Washington. They were not entirely wrong, but they were also not entirely right. The land had been farmed for only a few decades. The knowledge of how to manage it was limited. The farmers had learned from their parents and neighbors. The parents and neighbors had learned from the same limited experience. There was no tradition of conservation on the plains. The tradition was one of extraction. The mental health of the people who lived through the Dust Bowl was deeply affected. The constant dust, the constant wind, the constant darkness, the constant fear. These were not normal conditions. People experienced what today would be called post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares, they had anxiety, they had depression, they had physical symptoms. The dust caused chronic respiratory problems. The stress caused heart problems. The isolation caused loneliness. But the people did not have access to mental health care. There were few doctors. There were no therapists. The stigma of mental illness was strong. People did not talk about it. They suffered in silence. They coped by working. They coped by moving. They coped by drinking. They coped by praying. The churches played a central role. They provided a sense of community. They provided a sense of hope. The preachers told the people that God was testing them. They told them that they would be rewarded in the afterlife. Some believed, some did not. The children of the Dust Bowl grew up with the memory of the storms. They carried the fear into adulthood. They passed it on to their own children. The family stories of the Dust Bowl are still told today. They are stories of survival. They are stories of loss. They are stories of resilience. They are stories of the day the sky turned black. The impact of the Dust Bowl on American culture was profound. It changed the way the country thought about the land. It led to the creation of the soil conservation movement. It led to the establishment of the National Resources Board. It led to the passage of the Taylor Grazing Act, which regulated grazing on public lands. It led to the creation of the Civilian Conservation Corps, which planted trees and built parks. It led to the expansion of the national park system. But the impact was not only on policy, it was on the imagination. The Dust Bowl became a symbol of the limits of human ambition. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of environmental exploitation. It became a story that the country told itself to remind itself of what could go wrong. The novel The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck was published in 1939. It told the story of the Joad family, who lost their farm in Oklahoma and migrated to California. The novel was based on Steinbeck's observations of the migrant camps. It was a work of fiction, but it was grounded in fact. It showed the suffering of the people. It showed the indifference of the landowners. It showed the cruelty of the system. The novel was controversial. It was banned in some places. It was praised in others. It was criticized for its portrayal of farmers and landowners. It was criticized for being too sympathetic to the migrants. But it was also praised for giving a voice to people who had been invisible. The novel won the Pulitzer Prize in 1940. It was adapted into a film the same year. The film was directed by John Ford and starred Henry Fonda. It brought the story to a national audience. The migrants themselves did not often see their lives reflected in the photographs and the novels. They were too busy surviving. They worked in the fields. They built new homes. They sent their children to school. They formed communities. They adapted. Over time, many of them succeeded. They bought land. They started businesses. They became part of California's economy and culture. But the pain of the migration never fully left them. It was passed down to their children and their grandchildren. It became part of the family story. What investigators found when they looked backward at the Dust Bowl was not just a story of environmental collapse. It was a story of systemic failure. The failure began with the assumption that the plains could be farmed like the Midwest. It continued with the lack of regulation on land use. It was compounded by the economic pressures that forced farmers to produce as much as possible, as cheaply as possible. And it was deepened by a drought that was beyond anyone's control. The human cost was staggering. In addition to those who died from dust pneumonia, there were those who died from starvation, exposure, and disease. There were those who died from despair. There were suicides. There were families who simply disappeared into the landscape, their names never recorded. The mental health toll was enormous. People who lived through the Dust Bowl reported nightmares, anxiety, and depression for years afterward. The constant darkness, the constant fear, the constant sound of the wind. And yet the people who stayed did not give up. They found ways to cope. They shared food. They shared shelter. They shared work. They formed cooperatives to buy seed and equipment. They supported each other when the government failed to act. They built schools and churches out of the ruins. They taught their children to read and write. They maintained their dignity in the face of overwhelming loss. The role of the federal government in the recovery was mixed. Some programs helped. The Soil Conservation Service was one of them. The Farm Security Administration provided loans to farmers to buy land and equipment. The Resettlement Administration moved families off marginal land and onto better farms. The Works Progress Administration provided jobs building roads, schools, and parks. The Civilian Conservation Corps employed young men. These programs put money into the economy and gave people a sense of purpose, but other programs hurt. The Agricultural Adjustment Act paid farmers to reduce production, but the payments went to landowners, not to sharecroppers and tenant farmers. The sharecroppers were often evicted as a result. The banks continued to foreclose on farms. The government did not stop them. The economic system favored large-scale agriculture over small family farms. That trend continued after the Dust Bowl ended. By 1939, the rains returned. The drought was over. The storms stopped. The land began to heal. Grasses grew back. The dust settled. The shelter belts held. The soil started to rebuild. But the scars remained. The landscape had been reshaped. Some areas were permanently altered. The Ogallala Aquifer, which lies beneath the plains, had been tapped for irrigation during the drought. The water was being used faster than it could be replaced. That problem would only grow worse in the decades to come. The Dust Bowl ended, but the lessons did not. In the 1950s, another drought struck the plains. It was nearly as severe as the 1930s, but this time the conservation practices were in place. The soil held. The dust storms were smaller. The skies did not turn black. The difference was the presence of shelter belts, contour plowing, and crop rotation. The lessons of the Dust Bowl had been applied, but the lessons were not applied everywhere. In the 1970s, a new wave of plowing began on the plains. The demand for wheat and corn increased. Farmers stopped rotating crops. They planted the same fields year after year. They used chemical fertilizers to compensate for the loss of soil fertility. They irrigated from the Ogallala aquifer. The water table began to drop. The soil began to erode again. Dust storms returned, though on a smaller scale. In the 1980s, another drought led to another spike in dust storms. The term Dust Bowl was used again. Some farmers remembered the 1930s, most did not. The cycle repeated itself. The land was pushed too hard, the rain stopped, the wind blew, the soil moved. The question of whether another Black Sunday could happen is not a historical question. It is a question about the present. The plains are still farmed. The soil is still being lost. The water is still being depleted. The climate is changing. The droughts are expected to become more frequent and more severe. The conservation practices that protected the land in the 1950s are not always followed. The pressure to produce cheap food is enormous. The system that caused the Dust Bowl has not been dismantled. It has been modified, but the underlying vulnerabilities remain. The story of the Dust Bowl is also a story about human resilience. It is about people who refused to be broken by the land they had broken. It is about the photographs and the novels and the reports that forced the nation to look at what it had done. It is about the wind and the dust and the darkness that became a symbol of what happens when we ignore the limits of the natural world. The survivors of the Dust Bowl carried the memory with them for the rest of their lives. They told their children. They told their grandchildren. The stories were passed down, often with the same details. The day the sky turned black, the day the world disappeared, the day they thought the end had come. In the town of Boise City, Oklahoma, the courthouse square still stands. It is the same square that was buried under drifts of dust in 1935. The town held a reunion in 1995, 60 years after Black Sunday. Some of the survivors came. They were old. They had wrinkled faces and thin hair. They remembered the storm. They remembered the fear. They remembered the sound. They stood in the square and looked at the sky. It was blue. The wind was calm. The dust was gone. One of them spoke. She said she still could not sleep when the wind blew. She said she still covered her face when she went outside on a dusty day. She said the dust was inside her. She said it never left. The memory of the Dust Bowl is not a relic of the past. It is a warning for the future. The land remembers. The wind remembers. The soil remembers. The question is whether we remember too, but remembering is not enough. Action is required. The lessons of the Dust Bowl must be applied in the present. The soil must be protected. The water must be conserved. The land must be managed with an understanding of its limits. The climate is changing. The droughts will come again. The question is whether we will be ready. The Dust Bowl was not an act of God. It was an act of humans. It was a failure of foresight, a failure of policy, and a failure of will. The same failures can happen again. The same consequences can be repeated. The same suffering can be inflicted. The people who lived through the Dust Bowl did not want to be forgotten. They wanted their story to be told. They wanted others to learn from their mistakes. They wanted the land to be treated with respect. They wanted the wind to stop carrying away the topsoil. They wanted the sky to stay blue. The sky turned black on April 14, 1935. It was a day that changed the way America saw itself. It was a day that revealed the fragility of human civilization. It was a day that showed the power of nature and the weakness of human systems. But it was also a day that showed the strength of human spirit. The people who survived the Dust Bowl did not give up. They rebuilt. They adapted. They learned. They passed on their knowledge. They made sure that the next generation would know what had happened. The question is whether the next generation will listen. The question is whether the lessons will be applied. The question is whether the dust will rise again. The answer is not yet known. It depends on what we do now. It depends on how we treat the land. It depends on how we manage the water. It depends on how we respond to the changing climate. It depends on whether we remember. The Dust Bowl is not over. It is waiting. The wind is waiting. The soil is waiting. The sky is waiting. The day the sky turned black is still in the memory of the land. And the land does not forget. On the morning of April 15, 1935, the sun rose over a landscape that had been transformed overnight. The town of Guymon, Oklahoma, lay under a blanket of fine gray silt. The main street was unrecognizable. Cars were buried up to their windshields. Drifts of dust reached the rooftops of single-story homes. The sky, which had turned black the day before, was now a pale, hazy yellow. The wind had not stopped. It had only changed direction. By 9 o'clock in the morning, local authorities began to assess the damage. Roads were impassable. Telephone lines were down. The telegraph was the only means of communication. The first reports reached the state capitol by mid-morning. In Liberal, Kansas, the hospital was overwhelmed. Patients with dust pneumonia filled the beds. The doctors had no effective treatment. They could only offer oxygen and water. Many did not survive. At 11 o'clock, a newspaper reporter from Boise City, Oklahoma, filed a story. He described the storm as a wall of black that moved across the plain at 40 miles per hour. He said it sounded like a freight train. He said the air became so thick with dust that people could not see their own hands in front of their faces. He said the temperature dropped 20 degrees in minutes. His story was picked up by wire services across the country. By noon, the death toll was being counted. In the Texas Panhandle alone, at least 12 people had died. In Kansas, 8. In Colorado, 5. In Oklahoma, 30. But those numbers were incomplete. Many deaths occurred on isolated farms where no one found the bodies for days. Some people died of suffocation while trying to walk from their house to the barn. Others died in car accidents when they drove into ditches blinded by the dust. The final count would never be known. Later estimates placed the number of direct deaths from Black Sunday at several hundred. The long-term toll from dust pneumonia and respiratory disease pushed that number into the thousands. What happened on April 14, 1935, was not an accident. It was the predictable outcome of a decade of poor land management. The southern plains had been plowed for wheat farming during World War I. The government had encouraged it. The price of wheat was high. Farmers borrowed money to buy tractors and land. They broke the sod that had held the soil for thousands of years. When the drought began in 1930, the wheat died. The soil was exposed. The wind did the rest. The federal government had been slow to respond. In 1934, the Taylor Grazing Act had been passed to regulate grazing on public lands, but it did little to stop the plowing. The Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933 paid farmers to reduce production, but it did not address soil conservation. The first real action came in 1934, when the Soil Erosion Service was created, but it was small and lacked funding. By the time Black Sunday struck, the agency had only begun to establish demonstration projects. The storm changed everything. Within a week, President Roosevelt had ordered a comprehensive assessment. Hugh Hammond Bennett, a soil scientist who had been warning about erosion for years, was summoned to Washington. He gave a presentation to Congress. He brought photographs of the damage. He described the scale of the disaster. He said that if nothing was done, the plains would become a desert. Congress listened. In April 1935, the Soil Conservation Service was established as a permanent agency within the Department of Agriculture. Bennett was appointed its first director, but the work of saving the land had only just begun. The Soil Conservation Service needed a plan. Bennett and his team drew on existing knowledge. They knew that deep plowing and monoculture were the problem. They knew that grass held soil. They knew that trees could slow the wind. They knew that contour plowing and terracing could reduce runoff. The question was how to convince farmers to change their methods. The answer was demonstration projects. In 1935, the Soil Conservation Service established a network of demonstration areas across the plains. Each project was a working farm where the new methods were applied. Farmers could see the results. They could see that a field planted in strips of wheat and grass lost less soil than a field planted solid to wheat. They could see that a shelter belt of trees reduced wind speed and trapped snow. They could see that contour plowing held rainwater where it fell. One of the first demonstration projects was in Dalhart, Texas. The area had been hit hard by the drought. The town had lost two-thirds of its population. The remaining farmers were desperate. The Soil Conservation Service brought in a team of agronomists and engineers. They laid out contour lines. They planted shelter belts. They rotated crops. Within 2 years, the demonstration farm was producing more wheat than the surrounding fields. The topsoil was staying in place. The wind still blew, but it no longer carried away the earth. The success of the demonstration projects led to a larger effort. The Shelter Belt Project, also known as the Great Plains Shelter Belt, was launched in 1934. It was a massive tree planting program that ran from the Canadian border to Texas. The goal was to plant 100 miles of trees along the 98th meridian. The trees would act as windbreaks. They would reduce erosion. They would provide habitat for wildlife. They would also provide timber and fuel. The project was controversial. Some farmers thought it was a waste of money. Some scientists doubted that trees could survive in the dry climate, but the project went ahead. By 1942, more than 18,000 miles of shelter belts had been planted. The trees were mostly native species: cottonwood, hackberry, elm, and green ash. They were planted in rows spaced to slow the wind. They worked. Wind speeds behind the shelter belts were reduced by up to 40%. Soil erosion decreased. Crop yields increased. The shelter belts also changed the landscape. The plains, which had been treeless for centuries, began to look different. The rows of trees broke the monotony of the horizon. They provided shade for livestock. They became landmarks. Farmers who had opposed the program began to plant their own shelter belts. The practice became standard. But the recovery was not immediate. The drought continued through 1936 and into 1937. The dust storms did not stop. In March 1936, another massive storm swept across the plains. It was smaller than Black Sunday, but it still buried roads and killed livestock. The wind carried dust all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. Ships hundreds of miles offshore reported dust on their decks. The human toll continued to mount. Families who had stayed were now leaving. The exodus that began in 1930 accelerated. By 1937, an estimated 3.5 million people had left the plains. The majority went to California. They followed the same routes as the earlier migrants. They traveled in cars loaded with belongings. They stopped in camps along the way. They were called Okies, though many came from Texas, Kansas, and Colorado. The name was a badge of shame, but they wore it anyway. The migrants who reached California found a mixed reception. Some farmers welcomed them as cheap labor. Others drove them away. The large agricultural operations paid low wages. The living conditions were poor. The migrants lived in tents and shacks. They worked in the fields from sunrise to sunset. They were exploited by the landowners and the labor contractors. The government did little to help. The experience of the migrants was documented by photographers. Dorothea Lange worked for the Farm Security Administration. Her photograph of a woman named Florence Owens Thompson, known as Migrant Mother, became an icon of the Dust Bowl. The image shows a woman with a worried expression, her children huddled around her. The photograph was taken in a pea pickers camp in California. It captured the desperation of the time. It forced the nation to look at the human cost of the dust. Other photographers also documented the disaster. Arthur Rothstein photographed a farmer and his sons walking through a dust storm in Cimarron County, Oklahoma. The image is stark. The figures are barely visible through the haze. It shows the scale of the storm. It shows the isolation. It shows the struggle. The photographers worked for the federal government. Their images were used to promote the New Deal programs. They were published in newspapers and magazines. They were exhibited in galleries. They became part of the national memory. The Dust Bowl was not just a disaster. It was a story that was being told, shaped, and remembered. But the photographs could not capture the sound. The sound of a dust storm is unlike anything else. It is a low roar like a waterfall. It is accompanied by the hiss of sand hitting glass. It is punctuated by the cracking of wooden buildings. It is a sound that stays in the memory. Survivors described it as the sound of the world grinding to a halt. The smell of a dust storm is also distinctive. It is the smell of dry earth, of clay, of organic matter being ground into powder. It is the smell of a world that has become unhinged. People who lived through the Dust Bowl said they could taste the dust in their mouths for days after a storm. They said the dust got into their food, their water, their lungs. The long-term health effects were severe. Dust pneumonia was the most common cause of death during the Dust Bowl. It was a form of pneumoconiosis caused by inhaling fine particles of silty soil. The condition could be fatal. Many people died within days of exposure. Children were particularly vulnerable. Their lungs were smaller and their immune systems weaker. The death rate from pneumonia in the Dust Bowl states was double the national average. Respiratory problems persisted long after the dust settled. Survivors of the Dust Bowl had higher rates of asthma, chronic bronchitis, and emphysema. Studies later found that people who lived through the 193s in the plains had reduced lung function compared to people in other regions. The damage was permanent. The psychological effects were also profound. The constant stress of the dust, the drought, and the economic hardship took a toll. Depression was common. Suicides increased. The rate of suicide in the Dust Bowl states rose by 50% during the 193s. Many families simply gave up. They stopped farming. They stopped trying. They waited for the end. The end came slowly. The drought broke in the spring of 1939. Rains returned to the plains. The grass began to grow again. The dust storms stopped. The shelter belts held. The soil began to recover, but the recovery was partial. The land had been permanently changed. The topsoil that had blown away was gone. It would take centuries to replace. The Ogallala aquifer, which had been tapped for irrigation, was being depleted. That problem would only grow worse. The return of rain did not bring back the people who had left. Many of the migrants who had gone to California stayed. They found work. They started new lives. They never returned to the plains. The population of the rural counties continued to decline. The towns that had been abandoned did not come back. The landscape became emptier. Those who stayed faced a different future. The Dust Bowl had changed the way they farmed. They now used contour plowing, crop rotation, and shelter belts. They planted drought-resistant crops. They built ponds and dug wells. They learned to live with the land, not against it. But the lessons of the Dust Bowl were not applied everywhere. After World War II, the demand for wheat exploded. The price of wheat was high. The federal government encouraged farmers to plant from fence row to fence row. The shelter belts were cut down to make room for larger fields. The tractors were bigger. The plows were deeper. The soil was once again exposed. In the 195s, a severe drought hit the plains. It was similar in intensity to the 193s drought, but this time the damage was less severe. The conservation practices that had been established in the 193s were still in place. The shelter belts, though reduced, still stood. The contour plowing and crop rotation had become standard. The dust storms were smaller. The skies did not turn black. The difference was the presence of the conservation infrastructure. But the 195s drought also exposed new problems. The irrigation from the Ogallala aquifer had increased dramatically after World War II. Farmers drilled wells. They installed center pivot irrigation systems. They pumped water from the aquifer at an unsustainable rate. The water table began to drop. By the 1970s, the pumping rate exceeded the recharge rate by a factor of 10. The aquifer was being drained. The Ogallala aquifer underlies 8 states: South Dakota, Nebraska, Wyoming, Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Texas. It is one of the largest freshwater aquifers in the world. It supplies water for irrigation, drinking, and industry. It is the lifeblood of the plains, but it is finite. The water that is being pumped today is ancient water accumulated over thousands of years. Once it is gone, it is gone. The depletion of the aquifer is the next chapter in the story of the Dust Bowl. It is a slow-motion disaster. The water table is dropping by several feet per year in some areas. The cost of pumping is increasing. Farmers are irrigating less. The land is returning to dryland farming. The risk of dust storms is increasing. In 2012, another severe drought struck the plains. It was the worst since the 1950s. The dust storms returned. In 2013, a massive dust storm swept across the Texas Panhandle. It was visible from space. It stretched for miles. It was reminiscent of the 1930s. The newspapers called it a mini dust bowl, but the 2012 drought was not as severe as the 1930s. The rains returned after a few years. The dust storms subsided, but the pattern was the same. The land was pushed too hard. The water was extracted too quickly. The soil was left unprotected. The wind blew. The question of whether another Black Sunday could happen is not a hypothetical. It is a matter of when, not if. The conditions that caused the Dust Bowl are still present. The land is still being farmed. The water is still being depleted. The climate is changing. The droughts are expected to become more frequent and more intense. The conservation practices that protected the land in the 1950s are not being maintained. The shelter belts are aging. Some have been removed. The crop rotation has been replaced by monoculture. The soil is being degraded. The science of soil health has advanced since the 1930s. We now know that soil is a living system. It is not just dirt. It is a complex ecosystem of microorganisms, fungi, insects, and plants. It takes hundreds of years to form an inch of topsoil. It can be lost in a single storm. We know how to protect it. We have the tools. The question is whether we will use them. The Dust Bowl was a wake-up call. It forced the nation to confront the consequences of its actions. It led to the creation of the Soil Conservation Service. It led to the Shelter Belt program. It led to new farming practices. It changed the way we think about the land. But the wake-up call has faded. The memory has dimmed. The survivors of the Dust Bowl are almost all gone now. The last known survivor of Black Sunday died in Tuzirat-Watwo. Her name was Elma G. She was 99 years old. She remembered the day the sky turned black. She remembered the fear. She remembered the sound. She said she still woke up in the middle of the night thinking of the dust. With her passing, the living memory of the Dust Bowl has ended. What remains is the written record, the photographs, the oral histories, the scientific data. And the land itself. The land still holds the scars. In some places the soil is still thin, the dust still blows, the wind still carries away the topsoil. The legacy of the Dust Bowl is not just a lesson, it is a warning. The same mistakes can be made again, the same failures can occur, the same suffering can be inflicted. The difference is that now we have the knowledge. We know what caused the Dust Bowl. We know how to prevent it. The question is whether we have the will. The Dust Bowl ended, but the conditions that created it have not disappeared. The pressure to produce cheap food is immense. The economic system rewards short-term profits over long-term sustainability. The federal government still subsidizes crop insurance and commodity programs that encourage risky farming. The incentives are misaligned. The result is that the land is being pushed beyond its limits. The Ogallala Aquifer is the most pressing example. If the current rate of pumping continues, the aquifer will be largely depleted within 50 years. The impact on agriculture will be catastrophic. The plains will revert to grassland. The farms will be abandoned. The population will decline. The dust will return, but it does not have to be that way. There are alternatives. Farmers can adopt water conservation practices. They can switch to less water-intensive crops. They can use drip irrigation. They can plant cover crops. They can rotate grazing. They can restore the soil health. They can rebuild the topsoil. There are programs to help. The Natural Resources Conservation Service, the successor to the Soil Conservation Service, provides technical assistance and funding for conservation practices. The Conservation Stewardship Program pays farmers to improve soil health. The Environmental Quality Incentives Program provides cost share for water conservation. The programs exist. The question is whether they are used. The Dust Bowl was a tragedy, but it was also a turning point. It showed that humans could destroy a landscape. It also showed that humans could restore it. The recovery of the plains after the 1930s was not inevitable. It was the result of deliberate action. It was the result of government programs, scientific research, and farmer cooperation. It was the result of millions of small decisions made over a decade. The question for the present is whether we can repeat that effort. The challenges are different now. The climate is changing, the population is larger, the economic pressures are greater, but the principles are the same. The land must be treated with respect. The soil must be protected. The water must be conserved. The lessons of the Dust Bowl must be applied. The day the sky turned black is still in the memory of the land. The land does not forget. The wind does not forget. The soil does not forget. The question is whether we remember, and if we remember, whether we act. On a clear afternoon in December 2021, the residents of Lamar, Colorado, saw something they had not seen in decades. A massive wall of dust rose on the horizon. It was 3,000 feet high. It moved at 40 miles per hour. By the time it reached the town, visibility was zero. The sky turned brown. Cars pulled over. People covered their faces. The storm lasted for several hours. When it was over, a layer of dust covered everything. It was a reminder that the Dust Bowl was not just history. It was a present reality. That storm was not an isolated event. In 2020 and 2021, the southern plains experienced severe drought. The topsoil was dry. The wind picked it up. The Conservation Reserve Program, which pays farmers to leave land in grass, had been reduced over the previous decade. Between 2007 and 2019, the program lost nearly 10 million acres. Those acres were plowed up for corn and soybeans, often on marginal land. The soil was exposed. The wind erosion increased. What happened in the 2010s and 2010s was not a repeat of the 1930s. The scale was smaller. The storms were less frequent, but the pattern was the same. The land was pushed beyond its limits. Economic incentives encouraged short-term production over long-term stewardship. The result was a slow recovery of the dust. In 2014, researchers from the University of Utah used satellite data to map dust storms across the Great Plains. They found that the number of large dust events had doubled since the 1990s. The increase was linked to drought and land use change. In the southern plains, the expansion of cotton farming in Texas and Oklahoma had removed native grass. The soil was left bare. The wind did the rest. At 10:30 a.m. on March 6, 2015, a wall of dust 2,500 feet high swept across the Texas panhandle near the town of Dimmitt. It was captured on dashcam footage. The storm moved at 50 miles per hour. It knocked out power lines. It blinded drivers. It was one of over 100 dust storms reported in the region that year. The question is why this is happening again. The answer lies in the economic and policy decisions made after World War II. The Dust Bowl had led to the creation of the Soil Conservation Service and the adoption of conservation practices. But those practices did not become permanent. The pressure to produce cheap food never went away. In the 1970s, high commodity prices led farmers to plow up millions of acres of grassland. In the 2000s, the biofuel boom did the same. Every time grain prices rose, the sodbusters returned. The federal crop insurance program played a key role. It was originally designed to protect farmers from catastrophic losses, but over time, it became a safety net that encouraged risk-taking. Farmers could plant on marginal land knowing they would be compensated if the crop failed. The program did not require conservation practices. The land was left exposed. By 2020, the Government Accountability Office reported that crop insurance subsidies had increased the conversion of grassland to cropland by an estimated 1.7 million acres per year. The lost grass was often the only thing holding the soil in place. The wind erosion increased. The dust storms returned. The science of soil erosion had advanced dramatically since the 1930s. Wind tunnels and computer models now allow researchers to predict how much soil will be lost under different conditions. The USDA's wind erosion equation calculates the rate of erosion based on soil texture, surface roughness, climate, and vegetation. But the equation is only as good as the data, and the data showed that erosion was increasing. In 2018, The USDA's National Resources Inventory reported that wind erosion on cropland in the Great Plains had risen to an average of 4.5 tons per acre per year. In some counties, it exceeded 10 tons. That was still less than the 193's, but it was moving in the wrong direction. The Ogallala aquifer depletion added another layer of risk. As the water table dropped, farmers had to drill deeper wells. The cost of pumping increased. Some switched from irrigated to dryland farming. Dryland farming is more dependent on rainfall. When drought comes, the crops fail. The bare fields are vulnerable to wind. In 2022, a study by Kansas State University found that the portion of the Ogallala under Kansas could run out of economically usable water within 30 years. The study used data from thousands of wells. The rate of decline was accelerating. The water was being pumped at 10 times the recharge rate. The ancient water was being mined. The communities that depended on that water faced a future without it. In 2020, the town of Scott City, Kansas, population 1,800, had to truck in water because its wells went dry. The cost was passed on to residents. Some moved away. The population of the rural plains continued to decline. The memory of the Dust Bowl had faded, but the land remembered. In 2019, a team of soil scientists from the University of Colorado drilled cores in the Nebraska sandhills. They found layers of dust from the 193's preserved in the sediment. The dust was still there. The past was buried in the ground. The question of whether another Black Sunday could happen is not a hypothetical. The conditions are present. The land is vulnerable. The policies are permissive. The climate is warming. The droughts are expected to become more frequent and more intense. The IPCC projects that the Great Plains will experience longer dry spells and more extreme heat. That combination favors dust, but the story does not have to end that way. There are farmers who have adopted regenerative practices. They plant cover crops. They use no-till drilling. They rotate cattle on pasture. They build soil organic matter. Those practices reduce erosion and improve water infiltration. They are proven to work. One such farmer is David Legvald, who farms in Minnesota. In the 199's, he switched to no-till. He saw his soil improve. He reduced fertilizer use. He increased yields. He became an advocate for soil health. He said the key is to think of the soil as a resource, not just a medium for growing crops. In 2020, the Soil Health Institute estimated that adopting regenerative practices on all U.S. cropland would reduce wind erosion by 70%. That would bring it back to levels seen in the 195's. The technology exists. The knowledge exists. The question is the economic incentive. The federal government has tried to address this. The 2018 Farm Bill included funding for the Conservation Stewardship Program and the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. But those programs are voluntary. They are underfunded. They are subject to political changes. In 2020, the Trump administration proposed cuts to conservation programs. Congress did not approve all of them, but the uncertainty remained. The Dust Bowl was a national crisis. It prompted a national response. The federal government spent billions of dollars. It created agencies. It changed farming. That response was possible because the Dust Bowl was visible. The sky turned black. People died. The whole country watched. Today, the crisis is less visible. The aquifer depletion is underground. The erosion is gradual. The dust storms are smaller. But the consequences are just as real. The loss of topsoil is irreversible on human timescales. The loss of groundwater is irreversible. The land is being depleted. The question at the end of the 193's was whether the nation would learn from the disaster. It did for a time, but the learning has faded. The new generation does not remember. The land is being pushed again. The sky may not turn black in the same way. The storms may not be as dramatic, but the dust is still blowing. The wind is still taking the soil. The aquifer is still dropping. The cycle is repeating. The only difference is that we know what is happening. We have the data. We have the science. We have the tools. The question is whether we will use them. On the afternoon of April 14, 1935, the sky turned black over the Panhandle. People thought it was the end of the world. It was not. It was the beginning of a new understanding. That understanding is still relevant. The land does not forget. The wind does not forget. The soil does not forget. The memory of the Dust Bowl lives in the layers of sediment, in the oral histories, in the photographs of stranded families. It lives in the fields that are farmed today. The question is whether we remember, and if we remember, whether we act. At 2:15 p.m. on November 14, 2018, a dust storm reduced visibility to near zero on Interstate 70 near the Colorado-Kansas border. The wind had picked up topsoil from a recently plowed field 20 miles upwind. Within minutes, 13 vehicles collided in a chain of crashes that stretched over half a mile. 2 people were killed. 7 others were taken to hospitals with serious injuries. First responders described the scene as a war zone. The highway was closed for 6 hours. The Colorado State Patrol later confirmed that no hazardous materials were involved, but the cause was clear. The dust had come from a field that had been tilled in late October and left bare. What happened that afternoon was not an anomaly. It was a pattern. In 2017, a similar storm on Interstate 90 in South Dakota caused a pileup involving 20 vehicles. 1 person died. In 2019, a storm in New Mexico's Lee County overturned a semi-truck and forced the closure of U.S. Route 380. In 2020, a dust storm in the Texas Panhandle caused a 20-car pileup on Interstate 40. 3 people died. The National Weather Service issued dust storm warnings with increasing frequency. Between 2015 and 2020, the number of warnings issued in the Great Plains nearly tripled. The common thread in all these events was agricultural land left exposed. The specific fields varied, but the underlying physics did not. When the soil is dry and the vegetation is removed, the threshold wind speed needed to lift particles drops dramatically. For a sandy loam soil, that threshold is about 13 miles per hour. For a silt loam, it is slightly lower. In the Great Plains, winds exceeding that speed are common, especially in late fall and early spring when the ground is bare. The soil is lifted into the air. The larger particles bounce along the surface in a process called saltation. The smaller particles are suspended. They can travel hundreds of miles. In February 2019, a dust storm originating in eastern Colorado carried particles all the way to the Great Lakes. NASA satellite images showed a plume stretching from the plains to the upper Midwest. The dust contained phosphorus and pesticides. It settled on cities. It was measured in Milwaukee. It was measured in Chicago. The health consequences of this dust are not limited to crashes. Fine particulate matter known as PM2.5 enters the lungs and the bloodstream. It exacerbates asthma, heart disease, and respiratory infections. In the 193s, the death rate from dust pneumonia was estimated at 10,000 people. Modern studies have linked dust exposure to increased hospital admissions for cardiovascular and respiratory conditions. In 2017, a study by the University of California found that the return of dust storms in the Great Plains had caused an estimated 100 additional deaths per year from heart and lung disease. The study used county-level health data and wind erosion models. The causes of this resurgence are a convergence of climate, economics, and policy. The drought of 2012 was the most intense in the plains since the 193s rose. It was followed by another drought in 2017 and a multi-year dry spell from 2020 to 2021. The Palmer Drought Severity Index for the southern plains during those years approached the levels of the Dust Bowl. The difference was that the drought was shorter and the land was not as degraded. But the trend was clear. The Ogallala aquifer depletion creates a feedback loop. When the groundwater runs out, farmers either switch to dryland farming or abandon the land. Dryland farming in a low-rainfall environment is inherently risky. A single dry spell can wipe out the crop. The insurance payout covers the loss, but the soil remains bare for the next season. The wind takes it. The federal crop insurance program, as it currently exists, does not require conservation compliance for most policies. That means a farmer can plow a field of native grass, plant wheat, have the crop fail, and receive a payment. The field is then left without cover. The next windstorm erodes the topsoil. The insurance does not cover soil loss. The land degrades. The farmer may eventually surrender the land to the bank or the government, but the damage is done. In 2014, the Government Accountability Office found that nearly 80% of cropland insured under the federal program was not subject to any conservation requirements. The requirement had been removed in the 1996 Farm Bill. It was partially restored in the 2014 Farm Bill, but only for land that had not previously been farmed. The loophole meant that converted grassland could be insured without conservation plans. The number of acres converted to cropland increased. The soil science is clear. The USDA's wind erosion equation shows that no-till farming reduces erosion by up to 90% compared to conventional tillage. Cover crops reduce erosion by another 50%. But adoption rates remain low. In 2017, only about 15% of cropland in the Great Plains used no-till. The reasons are economic. No-till requires different equipment and management. Cover crops require seed, labor, and time. The return on investment is not immediate. The insurance system does not reward soil health. The market does not pay for it. The memory of the Dust Bowl is not the same as the knowledge of it. The knowledge is in the textbooks, the soil cores, the equations. The memory is fading. The farmers who survived the 193's rows are gone. Their children are retired. Their grandchildren are making decisions about the land. The land itself holds the memory in its structure. Soil, organic matter, once lost, takes decades to rebuild. The erosion is not just a problem for the present. It is a mortgage on the future. There are glimmers of change. In 2021, the USDA launched the Climate Smart Commodities Program, which pays farmers for practices that sequester carbon. Cover crops and no-till qualify. The program is funded with $3 billion from the Inflation Reduction Act. It is too early to know if it will scale. The pilot projects involve thousands of farmers, but the Great Plains has hundreds of thousands. The challenge is adoption at scale. The question of whether the sky will turn black again depends on the next decade. If the droughts intensify and the aquifer declines and the policies remain unchanged, the dust will return, not as a single event but as a recurring hazard. The infrastructure of the plains is not built for that. The highways, the hospitals, the schools, the towns are all vulnerable. The memory of the Dust Bowl lives in the sediment. The question is whether it lives in the decisions that are made today. The wind does not wait. The soil does not negotiate. The dust does not need permission. It only needs an open door.